And as it often is, sometimes you catch people during the break and you already hear interesting perspectives that didn't come out in the initial discussions. So I would actually like to give the word first to Ilisimatusarfik from NGOs, who just told me in the break and is willing to share and hear some of the experiences she had with public engagement, working with the company NGOs, which is the housing company here in Greenland.
Okay, I will try to explain it a lot. We use Facebook to catch people we want to come in contact with. And besides that, we also use the television spot and the radio spot. And because I know that if we want to catch people who are living here, we have to use that platform, because outside Nuuk, it is KNR are still the most important media to use. So if you want to come in contact with people, make some television spot or radio spot and use the Facebook and connect it to the homepage. And when we have some project, beside the letter to the persons, we are visiting them and explain them about the project, and I give them the email and the phone number. They can call if they have some problems, and they use it. If they have some problems, they contact us, and I deliver the information to the exchange cooperator, a project cooperator, a coordinator, I haven't used English for a while, but I think that's it.
Maybe I should say, if some of you don't feel comfortable speaking in English, we can translate if you want to make your comment in Danish or Greenlandic. So one of the things you also mentioned to me in the break, because I asked, isn't using social media like a one-direction communication rather than a dialogue that you're creating? But you said to me, people are very good at coming back if they're given the opportunity to contact you through an email address or a phone number. Yes. So an experience passed on. Any other experiences that people want to share? Hjalmar.
A small question to Eduardo's presentation, and thanks for your knowledge and experiences from around the world. And one thing I want to ask is that sometimes we find out if one company applies to operate in Greenland waters or territories or land areas. They have a certain name. Sometimes you can find out that this company with another name or a sister company has been operating in parts of Africa or South America within the indigenous areas. You mentioned reputation is very important. And sometimes their reputation, as we read the information, are not that good because they are disturbing, damaging and stuff in those areas. If such kind of company appears in Greenland, what will your advice be?
Thank you. A question from Inuit Circumpolar Council for Eduardo.
That's a very good question. And I think that at the end of the day, I think there are governments and governments. And thinking about from a Greenlandic perspective, that I think that what you could do is, number one, is this a very international company? Or is it a company that I'm heard of? Is a very international company, you ask them what has actually happened there. And you can even put some conditions before he provides you the license, for example, to be operator. And I say, please provide me a plan, show me what you have done before. Because, for example, in BP, Brazil, happened similar case as well. They were in an area, they were trying to get a specific area, and it was exactly the same period of the huge spill. what did the Brazilian government says? Oh my gosh, what can we do? Then legally, they could not reject without reasonable grounds. But legally, they can postpone forever. So what they did, actually, they asked more information, more information, more information. So they delayed 2 years the answer. Until the time they were satisfied, they actually have a plan, the conditions to move forward, then they gave. So what I would do if I would be working for the government of Greenland, first I need to see who is this company. Number two, I would see what is their reputation they have exactly and ask them to provide their feedback, what exactly happened. And I would see their financial conditions. Because in the day, what happens as well, quite often, as you mentioned, small companies, part of big companies. Because you might create a subsidiary or a branch or a representation office. If they do that, you make sure that the mother company or the affiliate or related company provide the financial guarantees and they're on the hook. Because if something happened here, I'll go after you in Norway, I'll go after you in US or whatever that might be. Because in some cases, people done this poorly, that the company here bankrupt and they didn't have a way to go back to the mother or other companies. So it's important to have collaterals and provisions to make sure that the whole system or the other companies are liable for that.
Sometimes it's difficult to find out the companies are associated.
That is a good point. I'll give another example without telling the name of the country. I was in East Africa, in a specific place in East Africa. So when I was working for another company, and I went to check the areas to do invest, and then they usually do like you go for the government, and Nadia can show you the same. She showed you a beautiful map of your country. This is the areas. When I went there, I was surprised. The whole country was taken over, and I said, how come? So I saw like all these tops and these blocks, and I heard these companies called Simba, Safari, Bajari. I said like, who is this company? Never heard of them. Then what you need to do is something very specific. It's called asset integrity due diligence. How do you do that? Because let's say, for example, I want to invest in a company. Of course, if you want to go to do business with Statoil, BP, it's easy to find information. But if you are a private company in middle of nowhere, and I don't know who you are, what do I care? Reputation. The largest company who do this is called Crow. K-R-U-L-L. And also there is also risk integrity. There are a few companies who are based off ex-CIA, ex-Mossad, whatever, private intelligence, some diplomats, and some business people. They actually can find out a lot of information that is really hard to find. And they do by legal means, and some companies do by not very transparent legal means as well to find out information. You need to be careful about that as well. And they can tell you, give a list. I was subject to this because I has done business in Afghanistan and other places, so the CIA has to scrutinize me in KGB, whatever. So they have a profile of you. And I send you a list on where you work, who you married, who are your kids. If you had them, where you had done business, they know everything about everything. You can hire those companies. They can provide you, not you, but the government. If I'll be the government, I'll be certainly concerned before giving a contract to a company I didn't know. So I'll ask them, provide me information, and I use my own sources to verify the information you gave me is also true, or maybe I find out something you did not tell me as well. Because if you are not public listed, I don't know exactly all the information you're giving to me, especially if you're coming, let's say, from the Middle East or Far East Asia. How do you know if what they tell is true? Of course, you can come to the embassy, you can find out the information, but in the day, there are companies who do this kind of work and can find more about if their reputation is good or bad. It costs some money, but sometimes it's worth.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? So one thing I really took out of the first panel debate was this thought about why are we not evaluating? And the question was actually raised for Nadia in relation to the government, but is it necessarily the government's responsibility to do evaluation, or is it the research community, where is this responsibility placed? And so we have, even though not many projects are implemented in Greenland today, we do have quite a lot of exploration going on. And there are also people who are already, from the companies, who are already engaging with the communities also prior to the impact assessment processes. So I think there are lessons to be learned also from the projects that were not implemented, but already, for example, the Isua iron ore mining project, where a consultation was taking place, the Alcoa project, and so on. So it doesn't take necessarily an implemented mine to evaluate the performance in relation to public participation. So that was one of the things that I noted. And I don't know if there are any other thoughts on this, but I would definitely take it forward to my students to promote the idea of following these types of questions. We can even do it on the master level of projects.
Yeah, I can expand a little bit on this evaluation, because my question is when a public hearing is actually stopping. I mean, when does it stop? And I understand that stability, we all heard that is really, really important for the companies. But when the public hearing has been there and all the agreements has been signed, I mean, there are changes. Some projects might scale down, and expectations among the locals will also have to be scaled down. And maybe they were promised that 60 people would work from the village, and then it ends up that only 20 people works there. So I'm thinking about, would it be possible to continue the public hearing or some kind of negotiation that could sort of be prolonged into the exploitation phase, and not just when the project is ended?
A response, maybe?
I used to work for the municipality here in Nuuk, and in the impact benefit agreement, there is follow-up negotiations every year about you following local employment percentages that's in the IBA. But the IBA is not mandatory. It's only a guideline, so there's no punishment for not following the percentages of local employment in the IBA I have seen yet. So there is follow-up in the exploitation phase. I know the Rubin mine here south of Nuuk, that they have a plan and they have to meet every year and follow up about their following the IBA. But it's not mandatory, which I thought it should be. But there is a process. This is a process of meetings about your following the IBA. There's no plans of making the employment percentage mandatory, not even the Citronenfjord. So I think there's a lack of punishment if you don't follow the IBA.
Actually, there are two separate things. One is the agreement between the investors and the government. One is the commitment between the company and the local communities and the UIBA. UIBA sometimes, as you mentioned here, I was a bit surprised. There is a guidance. In a couple of the countries, there is a binding commitment. If you don't do it, I may sue you, because it's kind of signing an agreement with someone. It's a bit surprising that there's a guidance, because a guidance you can just provide as my own company. My own company has a guidance to provide help to the communities, but that's my company guidance. But when I have a commitment with someone, I expect to be a contract if I'll be advising the local communities. What you could do, I have seen some guides, they do, for example, every certain period of time. Let's say, for example, in some countries, oil and gas, they do every 5, 10, 15 years, you might have a renegotiation period. And even sometimes the government can change the terms. It's called like an economic equilibrium clause, that the government can pass a new law, change the terms of the conditions of the agreement. You sit together to find the re-equilibrium based on the real agreement because of new condition that happen. It's a messy process, believe me, but you can do that. So I think there are ways you can try to find out which is true, because the conditions today might change in the next 20, 50 years. And in theory, you have provisions that the whole agreement also stabilize. That's why, for example, if you have certain types of taxation, people might claim you have to review it later on, because that taxation does not consider that. So that's why your tax regime should consider upper price of oil, low price of oil, this. If you don't have that, then you have to sit again and say, look, it doesn't work. Either you do this or go back home. So you need to sit and do things.
Yeah, thank you. I'd just like to follow up on the issue of when participation takes place, because I think it's really, really interesting to talk about ongoing participation. And actually, Kisa led an excellent seminar a couple of months ago exactly on this concept of the social license to operate. You get a license from the government, yes, no, it's a piece of paper, it's been approved, and off you go. But to have acceptance of the community is something that it isn't a one-time thing. It has to be an ongoing process, and people have to feel like they're getting information, and all the promises that were made are actually coming through. And that means information, but it also means receiving information from the public. So there will almost certainly be unintended consequences from any project. There will be social impacts that weren't anticipated. Some of them might be positive, and some of them might not be. There might be impacts on wildlife and hunting that weren't anticipated because they couldn't have been foreseen in animal behavior. And again, we have to have a way of bringing that in and responding to that. So it's not just a matter of having, a one-time license or even a one-time IBA that's very fixed. This has to be something that's in continuous development. We also have to go back the way as to when it begins. So we talk about free, prior and informed consent. And when is that consultation taking place? Because one of the differences in oil and gas and mining in Greenland is when that initial consultation takes place and the social impact dialogue takes place, because it's much later in the mining industry than it is for oil and gas. In fact, it takes place after you have the feasibility. Then you start asking people what they think about it. But what Anne and I have discovered is that there's a lot of impacts way before you get to that stage. The minute you send them someone up on a mountain with a lamp and a pick, you have people talking about it in the community about what's going to happen, and it's years and years before they actually get a chance to have their say.
Thanks. Yeah. Anybody else who wants the chance before I give it to Eduardo? I think there's some up here. Yeah. Can you?
It's very difficult with the coffee cups and everything. I'm sorry I didn't present myself the first time. I'm Marianne Lykke Thomsen, and I work for Transparency International Greenland. And it's really a question here, because the dialogue between the two of you really made me confused. I have always understood IBAs to be mandatory and not to be a guideline. There may be parts of it that is guideline, because you're now talking about recruiting local workers, and it might not be possible to actually fulfill that obligation. But otherwise, I certainly agree with you that the impression for me is that it's certainly binding. So is anybody here able to answer that question? We don't have the people that are.
I think you can give it back. One more if you want to.
I'll let Nadia. Yes, it is binding in the sense that it's tied up operational license, but of course, like with the use of local labor, if maybe the company cannot find the amount that were agreed to, but then they have to justify it. They cannot just say, oh, we just didn't. They have to state why not. And that's why the IBA is negotiated every year. It's to adjust to the community as well, to ensure that the community get as much out of it as possible. But of course, the main responsibility of this is also the municipalities and the government. So it's many agencies that are working on this together, but it is mandatory. They need to have an IBA and they need to follow it. And if they are not able to with the use of local workforce, they have to justify it. So.
But there's no economic consequences for the company if they don't fulfill the percentage of local employment. Not in the Ruby project. I know that.
Yeah, I think that's true for the Ruby project. Yeah, I don't know what's agreed on the new ABAs.
But we agree that impact benefit agreements are a legal requirement in Greenland, and they follow up on the social impact assessments. But I think what Kåre means when he talks about it not being mandatory, you talk about the follow-up issues and the consequences related to that. Yeah. Emma?
Sorry. So just to clarify, you're saying it's a legally binding commitment and it's related to getting access to or getting the licenses. But the contract itself, does that have legal weight? I mean, is the contract a legal document? Is that the question? It's not, or it is a legal document, but there are no sanctions. So it's just not implemented properly. Is that the...
I think we have somebody, well, it's really a pity that we don't have anybody from the Ministry of Industry and Labour here to answer to these questions, but we do have some experts in the neighbouring.
Sorry. Yeah, I'm from the Ministry of Nature and Environment, so we often get the question how legally binding is an environmental requirement, and they're quite similar. The EIA follows the SIA. So just to point it out that yes, the license is a legally binding document. It's signed by all parties. The IBA is a license term, so that means breach of the IBA is breach of a license term. And if you break a license term, there are various sanction options. So it's sort of, of course has to be proportionate. So breaking one small term doesn't mean that you go to the full sanction, but ultimately you can, if you break a lot of license terms, you can withdraw the license. And the Mineral Resources Act also opens the option of fines, so economic sanctions. Just to sort of clarify that.
That was very good.
Yeah.
But did you have a comment of your own too?
No, it was more sort of. I just wanted to explain the sanction options and the fine systems, because we do have some handles to pull if the license terms are broken, legal terms. Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that. Have they been used? Do you know?
Well, it's I'm not sure I have a full memory of all, but it's not uncommon to issue orders, for instance. Issue an order to say you need to finalize this or that, or yeah. So that's quite a regular part of the system. Yeah.
Thank you, Naya. And Kai?
Thank you very much. So this is again the skeptical lawyer talking. I certainly recognize the benefits of legal sanctions, and I think that's definitely a strength, and also actually connects with the social license to operate, because it can make it very obvious, very visible, if a company doesn't observe the conditions for or the contractual conditions for a license. But seeing also that we have a Transparency Greenland present. I was wondering about the other aspect of sanctions, which is like, well, maybe again, lawyers, we often find it difficult to understand like investors' decisions, which was also mentioned before the break, to say withdrawal from collaboration as something that's a sanction. But from the company perspective, obviously this can be a sanction because a company loses economic opportunities, it may cost it significantly. Reputational damage may be something that companies have to invest a lot in remedying or repairing through expensive campaigns. There's an old story saying that for each one bad story in the press, a company actually needs 10 good stories. So I would be interested to hear, and again, this is the outsider coming to Greenland, not knowing very much about Greenland and learning every time I hear something. So I would be interested to hear about the experience here so far in terms of any of these sort of issues, maybe just debates on whether companies are actually honoring their obligations, and how the media, how civil society organizations, how the public address this as part of these other not legal sanctions, but still something that can exert pressure on companies?
That's a hard question.
Are you willing to try? I'll try to.
Okay, I would say it's a hard question, Karin. My name is Anita Hoffer, and I'm the chair of Transparency International Greenland. I would say maybe some of the others NGO, please skip in, because, well, we're not the only one, but I would say lots of the NGOs don't have that much resources. So for us, it can be hard to be effective watchdog, if we could say so. And maybe the public has the same problem, if you can say so. And the media as well. So the different watchdog roles have a hard time to follow up and to have opinion on every issues. So I would say we are weak watchdogs, every one of us. I don't know if you can elaborate on that, but we're trying. Yeah, that's what. Cole, if you want.
Before I hand it to Cole, I'll just comment briefly myself on that, because I've just done fieldwork together with Rachel in South Greenland and met with people to talk about, the public consultations that they've been engaged in, amongst others. And some of the things that was mentioned several times was this about the role of the NGOs in relation to acting as a watchdog. And there was also some frustrations about some of the international NGOs coming in, and a lack of trust of the international NGOs necessarily, protecting local interests. So I guess the pressure on you being present in Greenland is even larger than in many other countries.
Again, WWF. Being a watchdog, and like the uranium project in South Greenland is very complex, and some of the NGOs that comes into Greenland talking about this project are very biased and not science-based, to my opinion. So this is a very difficult project. WWF is science-based and will keep on being that. And some of the companies, especially GME that runs the uranium project, have been so bad in their public relations, and even have made pressure on the government with an act of information that was after pressure the government withdraw this act of information. So the GME really doesn't care about their reputation here in Greenland, to my opinion. So will they behave in a production phase? I don't know. I'm a little suspicious about this project. So we are trying to make as much information and trying to make it science-based and objective. And as we talked about, we really want the big companies that cares about their reputation, like the Shell. They made some seismic testing, and they were so much more. They made voluntarily more marine mammals and bird observers on their ships. So there was some good intentions from the bigger companies, and we saw Cairn that didn't really care about the public relation. We had GME that, to my opinion, doesn't care about it. So it's kind of complex and is case to case, but we're doing what we can to bring information to the public. Does that answer your question a little?
And even at the same time acting watchdog also over the other NGOs, so there is a big challenge. Sure.
I think also to answer your question, it's important to make a distinction. That's why mining has very different than oil and gas, because mining is pretty much on land. There are very few cases you go into the mining offshore. Oil and gas predominantly offshore. So for example, if I'm a foreign company, in case of Cairn, for example, they're doing offshore operations, correct? How much they need to get involved with local people? Close to zero. I come here, I sign with the government, I come to my cruise ship, come to Nuuk or whatever, they fly from helicopter, go in the middle of the ocean, they come back, and I fly back home. How much they interact with the local community? Close to zero. Not the project. You have someone outside the village, then it's different. I am disturbing the village, they're next to my project. If someone doesn't like my operation car or whatever, offshore, what can you do? You take a boat and go to like 80 kilometers, 100 kilometers from the coast to try to do something with me? I don't think I have the resource and the time to do that. So that's why I think the interaction varies to the project. And whenever it talks about offshore, less involvement, unless you're for a bigger company. And the bigger company, as I mentioned, Shell, is considered more, not so much about the local people, more about the fishermen, the marine environment. But whenever you will go to the entity onshore, you're leading daily with the people. That's why I tend to have more attention, more concern. That's why I think you need to see as well, in different cases, might have different procedures as well.
I think actually it's a really interesting question that you're raising about whether we want, or saying that we want the larger companies that we know are ready to perform well. Also because, as you say, Eduardo, it's really different between the offshore and the onshore. And what is often seen in the Arctic is actually that it's mostly junior companies that are undertaking mineral exploration. And junior companies are often companies built up from a couple of geologists connecting the people needed to do exploration in a certain area. And they're exploring with the purpose of selling their license when they get a permission. So these junior companies are sometimes known, I know from Canada for example, to not necessarily perform very well in relation to keeping the dialogue with the communities and so on, as we're talking about. On the other hand, many of the projects in Greenland that are going on, these junior companies, they're paying license money to do exploration, and maybe 80 out of 100 projects never make it to the production phase. So it's actually a big income to Greenland. So what is the challenge here, and what is it actually that we need to be able to do? Creating a...
Are minerals onshore?
Yeah, onshore, that's what I'm talking about.
But there is an environmental spill, significant. Would these local people be able to, let's say there is a huge environment damage, $100 million, then what happens?
So are we talking about offshore?
Yeah, or even onshore, less likely, but could happen somewhere. Who will pay for that?
The companies.
A small company?
Yeah, they have to deposit money prior to getting a production license.
Yeah, but you don't know how much environmental damage.
No. I will pass it on now because I took the word too long already.
I just want to mention that I'm Lars again, Lars Jørgen, that when we talk about the involving of the workers from the local, I was thinking of the Alcoa project we have close to Manitok, and they needed about 200 to 400 people working there. And I remember that I was living in Sisimiut. Local entrepreneurs in Sisimiut, companies, were afraid of that they're going to lose electrician, plumbers, because we are so few in Greenland. Because everybody wants to get job at the mineral companies, and so people and the local entrepreneurs were afraid of that they're going to lose their employees, Sisimiut and other places, because everybody wants to work there.
So a very important issue about the anxiety related to starvation of other local companies recruiting for the extractives, and just linking it back to the public participation issue. I expect that that's the arena, the public participation arena is the place where you can get insights of this kind to be able to plan wisely. And what does this mean if the main requirement or the main way of trying to create local benefits is from training? Eduardo, would you come back to Lars?
I'll just come back to first. Yes. Like, this happens to many companies. Like, I was working with some smaller companies. What happened, I'd say, for example, they have companies, unfortunately, they're not fair. And they come to talk to you, not to do business with you, to take your people. and take your data. And that's unfortunately happens. So at the end of the day, what you need to do as well, if you work for these local communities, local companies, you have very strong rules in terms of employment contract. And if you talk to a foreign company, you put conditions on your confidentiality agreement or whatever agreement you discuss with them. You are forbidden to hire anyone from a company for the next 2 or 5 years. Your employee cannot leave your company under these conditions. Otherwise, of course, it depends on the size of the project. For example, I was working on a project in Brazil. Like, imagine this multi-millionaire, billionaire in Brazil. They went to a company and say, look, I separated $500 million just to hire people. They went to a company and say, how much did you earn today? X. I give you 3X and $2 million to live today. Of course, you cannot protect yourself against those things, but it's not common this to happen. But at least you can put yourself in a position that you protect your company before talking to the larger companies. So they don't just take over you and observe you. So you need to be careful as you start to grow and people start to see the potential in you. Sometimes you want to invest in you, but actually sometimes you just want to take over you, a hostile takeover. So you need to be careful who you partner as well and to protect your people. But what was your other question? Was this?
It was, I was
okay,
just passing it on. Okay, we have time for one last comment or question. Anybody wants the last word before we head out for lunch?
Can I have just a final point?
I think, did you raise your hand? Okay, Eduardo, and then I'll come to you.
Okay. Just one final point for Greenland takeover is very important. And this happens a lot in Africa, very similar to here. What is your infrastructure? Close to zero, right? And then how do you have two options to monetize your business? Either you go to small scale projects, which has to be onshore, or big projects. Because let's say you're gonna find oil offshore. Amazing, I found, but not so necessarily. Because you might need to build a pipeline of gonna cost you $1 billion. You might have to have vessel gonna cost $5 billion. And you find out that the whole economics of the project is $300 million, which is pretty good, but not good enough to sustain the business. So that's why the real challenge you find is that a lot of your potential offshore can only happen if it's a huge project. Because your cost is really high, you don't have infrastructure, and it's very hard to do with that. More likely, you're gonna have onshore or very close to shallow, because the costs are smaller. And for example, if I find gas closer to the shore, not deep far away, then you're in trouble. Very close to shore, you can even drill from onshore, which sometimes can go even 2, 3, 4 kilometers, to offshore, way cheaper. You can use that gas into gas to power or elsewhere. So you can use some ways. But if you have to export far away, that's, I think, the real challenge you have for developing natural resources in Greenland. Then you have to focus more, I think, onshore. It's more realistic in this small case scenario, unless the price of oil go to 120, 100 is very unlikely, and you have huge discoveries. Then you can move on.
Thank you. I think actually it's a question to Eduardo. And I'm sorry. Well, it's a balance, as we can also see by this discussion, between the fact that we really want investments in Greenland. The economy needs some other input than fisheries, but also on the other hand, securing that we are following the right standards and we don't risk anything for the community or the environment. So in that case, there's been, of course, there is some international interest, but always taking into fact that they have to have a lot of risk-willing capital, because they have to make the infrastructure, they have to bring people, because we don't have enough high-skilled labor and so on. And sometimes we are asked in international settings what kind of requirements we have and if we have any deliberations on some of the requirements. And I have heard several times that I think we are covered by the European Union requirements in terms of not giving national investment warranties. I think it's called like that. So not giving a warranty to the company in terms of their investments. Do you have any experience with this from international settings? And what are the pitfalls in this? Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm from the Foreign Affairs Department of the Government of Greenland.
I think it's so good that you're asking Eduardo all these questions because we want to get the most out of our international experts now they're here.
Well, actually, it's a very good question. I think first thing, government, you assure nothing. The only thing you assure that you have the right to explore this area. What you might have a problem, I don't think you have any dispute here in Greenland? Any country who, like territorial border dispute? Is there any area? So, okay, so you have no problem. So the only thing you need to say, because I have seen sometimes governments offer the same contract in different countries and you have a border dispute. So here you don't have that issue. The only thing you need to assure is that you have the right to come to this area. Maybe you have to assure there is no past environmental damage there, because nobody want to come and find out. I have a case, a company in Mexico, look the mess what happened in Mexico. The investor went to talk to the Mexican government. Oh, let me award this contract here. They say, fantastic, to get the contract. And in Mexico, you have a national company called Pemex. And until 3 years ago, it was the only company who could do business in Mexico. And they made a spill there and didn't tell the government. They kept it secret. And then they give it back there to the government. And the government didn't know about that. And then the government gave the area to the investor. And the investor, when they touch the area, say, oh my gosh, there is a huge spill here. Not huge, but still. And legally speaking, you're liable for that. And it was in a mess, because the investor didn't want to do things until things were clear up. And then at the end of the day, they find out a weird legal solution. They call it a force majeure. It was not a future, not unforeseeable event, but still was happy for everybody. So you as a government, what you need to assure that there is no damage in the area, and you have the right to do things. If you find something, if you make this spill, if there is any market up and down, this is your risk. You as a government, you should not take any of these commercial risks. I think the other thing which I was surprised here is that anybody can clarify to me, is this Greenland subject to EU laws? Yes or no? Is it no?
No on mineral resources.
Okay, no on mineral resources. So at the end of the day, I think that gives a leverage to the Greenland government to negotiate their own standards, which can be good, can be bad. Because in the day, in theory, European Union has fairly high standards. And you can have a way lower standards. From a commercial point of view, that's give an edge. Because it might be cheaper to do exploration here than going to Norway. Because more environmental rules you have, increase the cost of the projects. And more protection requires, because it requires more labor, more people, more infrastructure, more procedures, it costs more. So in theory, you need to weight what is more important to you. To have the highest standards, but no business, or you have a mid-term standards that you're more competitive than other countries. So that's more like a policy, governmental decision that you can consider what's more important, the business, or to be more conservative and not doing the business until you get the exact same people. But in any case, what you can do is have securities, have collaterals. The issue have larger companies. Yes, Shell has made several problems, BP has, but they can pay you $1 billion penalty. They can pay you $5 billion. With that money, you can recover most things and can do other things, but small companies cannot. That's why small companies, you do small projects. That is more manageable.
That was a perfect end line because we're actually going to focus on standards in our next session. But first, now, it's time for lunch. And Rachel, do you know the practicalities around it? Oh, just outside. See you back here.